Hi, Denise Gwen, reading aloud for you from my short story, The Greasy Spoon. Chapter 35. The water in the shower started up again, only this time the hogs screamed in real pain. The last time they'd screamed in fright, but now they sounded as if they were really being killed. A movement from behind a stack of boxes made Nick jump. A diminutive figure materialized from behind them and stood in front of him, gazing at him with wide, frightened eyes. When she noticed the dead man, she let out a soft cry and bent down to her hands and knees and crawled over to him. "Lupe?" she said, and patted his shoulder, then broke down weeping. The person on the other side of the door stopped hammering, and an oddly tranquil moment settled upon the room. Nick gazed raptly at the young woman. She was so beautiful, with her tawny, mocha-tinged skin. He couldn't bear to tear his gaze away. What the hell was she doing here? She didn't belong here. Nobody did, but she of all people did not. She'd grown up in some gun and drug lord-ravaged country and escaped prostitution by smuggling herself into this country, and she'd counted herself lucky to land this miserable fucking job that no white person in their right mind would work at because of how dangerous it was. And yet, this was a good job for her because it paid an hourly wage that she could save up and send home to her family. She'd already lost one finger. What else would happen to her in this awful place? Get an arm lopped off? Lose an eye? Her life? Only, where were the farmers? And why were Nick and Ed the only ones in this room of death? At last, she wiped the tears off her cheeks with an angry gesture and gazed up defiantly at Nick. As she rose unsteadily, Nick scrambled to his feet and helped her to stand up. As he touched her arm, a frisson of desire licked his loins. Her skin was so soft. He held onto her hand and pressed gently. "The men? Where are the men?" Then he considered and said, "Les hombres?" "I speak a bit English," she said. "Good. Do you know where they went? El Patron?" Instead of answering, she pulled her hand free of Nick's and walked to the doorway that Jeb Jr. had been running in and out of. She opened the door and peered into the factory, and Nick looked over her shoulder. This was the main processing plant in the building, where the slaughtered hogs were carved up and processed. Hundreds of workers, wearing blood-stained aprons and gloves, stood at stainless steel tables with troughs for the blood to drain down into a cistern in the floor. The hogs' carcasses were mounted by their back hooves into hooks set into a rolling track installed onto rails in the concrete ceiling that moved them slowly through the factory. Their wide-open, dead eyes gazed vacantly at the floor as blood drained from their bodies. The carcasses looked eerily human. The first worker used an enormous knife to carve off the hog's head, then pushed the head forward into a box filled with them. The second man at the table sawed off a section of chest muscle and sliced it up into smaller strips, then pushed the meat forward onto a conveyor belt. Each man performed a separate function, carving off different sections of the carcass and pushing the muscle onto the conveyor belt until all that remained was bone and sinew. The last worker on the assembly line pulled the remaining bone off the hooks and sent it through a grinder as big as a washing machine. Nick didn't see any safety bars in front of the grinder to protect a human who might fall into it. The slabs of meat wound their way along the conveyor belt to another room where, Nick suspected, the neatly sliced slabs of pork were being wrapped up in cellophane and labels slapped on them, and the containers shipped off to grocery stores. Nick was mesmerized. He didn't notice when one of the workers looked up and started with surprise at the sight of them. Nick caught his gaze, saw the fear, and his heart leaped up into his throat. The girl smiled at the man, put her finger to her lips, and gestured at Nick. The man nodded and resumed cutting. The girl closed the metal door and locked it, then turned to Nick. "You are fortunate, Senor, that you avoid death. My dear Lupe kept you alive." He did. He couldn't think of anything else to say.